Happy Saturday, everybody. At the beginning of a set release, what I like to do is cover some budget decks. And so these have been some that I've been playing around with that are all commons and uncommons. And so this take it with a grain of salt. These are not decks that I think that you should try to take to a standard challenge. I think they're better for completing dailies while you grind up to the better upgraded version, which I will cover as well. So this one's leaning on the enchantment or the eerie combinations that we got in Duskmourn. So you've got like Inquisitive Glimmer, gives everything discounted price. Every time that you play an enchantment, you create a 1/1. Every time that you play an enchantment, you get a +1/+1. And then the Enduring Bond Warden can move those tokens when a creature dies to another creature that you control. Not sold on the Enduring Bond Warden. You could probably do some other form of cheap drop, but we do need some sort of early body that then can be the target of our other early enchantments, like Sheltered by Ghosts, which works really well against mono red with the lifelink and the ward 2. Makes it a very difficult target for them to remove, and then can kind of get you out of range of the mono red builds. Ethereal Armor gives +1/+1 and first strike for every enchantment that you control, so then it stacks on top of having the enchantment creatures as well. Feyflight is kind of like the +1/+0 and flying that we saw in the Boros deck that I covered yesterday, but it also allows you to give your creature hexproof at flash speed. So when we have blue, I definitely think this one is superior to the flight card that I can't remember the name of. And so we've got two ways of protecting our targets. We've got the Shard Mage's Rescue, which allows us to kind of punish the single point interaction, like Go for the Throat, Cut Down, Black Removal, Shock, Lightning Bolt, etc., being able to protect our threats. And Into the Floodmaw is another one that also helps tech against mono red, being able to bounce like a turn 0 leyline. We can just put it back into their hand, gift them a fish, because you can return a creature. If you gift them a fish, then you can return the permanent to their hand. And then because we don't have access to the rares, we're going to have to lean on the Desert Land and the Life Gain Land of Tranquil Cove and Lonely Oreo. I don't think that I can't stress this enough how important it is to craft lands, especially if you're looking to play Magic in the long term, because they allow you to run a lower land count. So this one being 16 white and 16 white and 14 blue allows you to even have the Into the Floodmaw 90% of the time on turn 1. That will be the budget build. And the upgrades for this one are relatively few. You don't really have to do too much. So you've got the Entity Tracker, which is a nice rare. Whenever an enchantment you control enters, you would draw a card. And then we've got the Enduring Innocence, which also, whenever a creature you control with power 2 less enters, draw a card. And that's what really makes the Gremlin Tamer worth running. So getting that additional card draw. And then when this thing dies, it also goes back to being an enchantment and still gives you the trigger off of future enchantments, giving you the 1/1 off of the Gremlin Tamer. The lands, we've got the Darker Wastes and the Seachrome Coast, which allows us to run a much lower land count. I think you could actually get away with running this as 20 and ditch the Demolition Fields, but it's always nice to have like a little bit, especially because we are trying to hit turn 3. So this gives us, if we see some more man lands, we'll see as the meta kind of settles. Demolition Field's usually okay. You could also run something like Fountain Port, Mirix, that sort of thing, just some sort of miscellaneous land. The creator of this deck was on MTG Goldfish, and I'm blanking on their name. They always do a budget list every set, so this was their list. And then the rest of the core is still the same. Second budget list is Selesnya Rabbits, and this one was created by J2S Josh. I think I tweaked the lands a little bit because they were running the Uncharted Haven, and I brought in the Blossoming Sands and the Cryosite Heath, but didn't touch anything else in the main. So this is kind of the go wide strategy. This one also punishes the single point interaction by having multiple rectangles in each one of the cards that you're playing, like the Head of the Homestead, creating the multiple bodies, and then Carrot Cake and Hop to It, creating multiple bodies that you then pump for your win condition off of Rabbit Response. Patchwork Banner is in here to give all of your bunnies +1/+1. Intrepid Rabbit also comes in with an additional body. Harvest Host gives you the card draw if you have like the offspring triggers the +1/+0 twice and then gives you a card draw. Warren Elder also allows you to pump the board with the rabbit response. And the Burgard Mentor is a star creature equal to the number of creatures that you control, so it gets absolutely massive. And then the Seasoned Wearing Guard puts in a fair amount of pressure with how many tokens that we're trying to build. So we've got this, a lot of times this plays out just as a 3/2 for 1 and can put a lot of pressure on your opponent. As far as the lands go, we do have some tech lands where the Lupine Village helps you dig and find additional threats in your library, and the Oak Hollow Village then later you can, if it gets into a kind of grindier matchup and you have excess mana, you can use it to put a +1/+1 counter on a rabbit that entered the battlefield this turn. So next up, we'll do the upgraded version. So this was the top performing Selesnya Rabbits deck before I went to Disney World. And so this one is, it's hard to say if it will actually survive the introduction of Pyroclasm into the meta. So as of today, Selesnya Rabbits is not actually in the top 8. So keep that in mind if you are crafting into it. It did well in Bloomborough. It may be back, but it may also be dead. It kind of depends. Right now is definitely not a great time for it because everybody's playing the Rakdos aggro and the mono red builds with the Leyline. And this deck struggles a little bit with that because you don't have the early interaction of like Elspeth Smite and Lay Down Arms and the early removal that's necessary to counter that strategy. And but if we start to see a shift away from that, which we usually will see later into the season, probably around Halloween, we may see a rise in Selesnya Rabbits again. Again, every Monday I go over a best of 1, best of 3 meta review where we kind of talk about the top performing decks, and that's a good way to kind of keep an eye on what is performing well. And so this one, forgot to sort it for the what you have to craft for it. This one, again, the reason why I'm stressing that it wasn't in the top 8 is that it is a relatively heavy investment if you are not set complete. And so I did eventually, I'm usually lagging a little bit because I tend to draft to collect the set. And so I didn't actually get all of the cards until I opened my 200 some odd packs after being done drafting the format. And so now I can finally play Selesnya Rabbits and it's gone. Such is the way of Magic. Sometimes the deck only is around for about a month. But yeah, we're basically leaning onto the same strategy of just bunny synergies. Phineas gives our +1/+1 to all of our bunnies on the board. The Quest Caller gives us a +1/+1. The Valley Might Caller gets +1/+1 every time that you're playing a bunny, so Hop to it gives it +3/+3. Pop Hatch Recruit punishes the single point interaction even further than just the general go wide strategy of the deck. Warren Warleader, I think we're going to see this card even outside of bunnies, just because it plays a lot like Adeline. It is one more expensive to play. Adeline was a busted mythic that we lost in rotation. This is doing a similar thing too. And Sanguine Evangelist gives us the board pump for our general go wide strategy. And then we have Knight Errant of Eos, which allows us to kind of counter the temporary lockdown and Sunfall, which this deck is weak against. This allows us to refuel our hand and find additional threats to play. And then Season of the Burrow can reanimate a mana value 3 or less from your graveyard and make it indestructible, which can be really backbending. You can also just create 5 1/1 rabbits for 5. And you can also exile a problematic card and give them they get to draw a card if you do that, but it's a decent option. Cavern of Souls then makes it so that all of our bunnies can't be counterspelled. We'll see if we're starting to see a slight more a spike in Azorius control this season. We didn't really see it that much in Bloomborough, but I think they got some interesting tools, and we might start seeing a rise in that archetype. So keep your eyes out on whether or not to bring in the Cavern of Souls for your tribal decks. And then we've got the Razor Verge Thicket and the Brushland, which again, I can't stress enough. If you're going to be playing Magic a long time, these lands would be one of the first crafts that I would do. Speaking of the kind of importance of crafting, I forgot to mention, generally the other cards are rather specific to this archetype. Knight Errant of Eos sees play in Boros Convoke, which has also fallen out in popularity. Same with the Sanguine Evangelist. So definitely tread with care, considering how much of an investment this deck is. All right, third up on the list here is the budget Gruul or red-green aggro deck. And this one is very... I like this one for the mono red build as far as budget goes, because I think that it has the most power coming off of the Snakeskin Veil and the Overprotect if you're not going to be running the Slickshot Show-Off, because the budget version of the Slickshot Show-Off is the Picnic Ruiner and maybe arguably the Kenra Spell Spear, both just trying to get a whole bunch of damage off of the combat spells of like Monstrous Rage and Giant Growth sometimes, Might of the Meek, Overprotect. We're seeing Overprotect run instead of Giant Growth in a lot of the lists after Bloomburrow. So you've got a whole bunch of cards that work well with those combat tricks. Whenever you target the Heartfire hero, it gets larger. Swift Spear has prowess, and Spell Spear has a double prowess. You can pay the the blue Phyrexian with life, so you do not need blue to be able to flip this into its backside. Electrostatic Infantry gets a +1/+1 counter every time that you do a spell, and then the Aloe Alchemist allows us to up Picnic Ruiners while also kind of keeping the creature count high. So Demonic Ruckus you can plot to then kind of increase popping all of your spells off in one turn. Shock is particularly nice for shooting the enemy Slickshot Show-Off out of the air and disrupting mono red in best of one. And then we've got the Bristling Backwoods and the Rugged Highlands, which are my budget option. You're going to be missing the untapped lands a little bit with this low aggressive curve, so definitely try to replace them with the upgrades as soon as you can. All right, and then the upgraded list for this, this is specifically for best of one. We see a slight variation in the lists being run for best of three than we do in best of one, but this was the top performing list, I believe, in week 5 of Bloomburrow, where we saw it pop up into the top 8. The deck is a little bit more consistent than its mono red counterparts, again, because of being able to answer your opponent's single point interaction with the Snakeskin Veil, so it doesn't just completely fold to them having an answer for your early threats. But it does still have the core of like Manifold Mouse and the Amberheart Challenger and the Heartfire Hero, which is a core that you'll see in a lot of red decks in best of one. The Slickshot Show-Off is another one that you'll see quite a bit in Rakdos aggro and mono red aggro, and is a relatively safe craft in my opinion, especially because best of one is usually a format that favors aggro because of, you know, how they designed the opening hands. And the Innkeeper's Talent is a way to trigger the Valiant and gives the deck a little bit more of some mid-range depth if your opponent does have the disruption. And then Questing Druid also gives us better dig. So you're a little bit weaker as far as like the perfect curve is considered, but you have a little bit more staying power if your opponent does have an answer. And then the Voldaren Thrillseeker allows us to fling a target very similar to the Callous Sellsword. I've seen some lists exploring actually running both. If you do run the Voldaren Thrillseeker, remember that you need to be able to play it for 3 and then 4 for the sacrifice, so you need a higher land count if that's the direction that you're going to take it. And then we've also got the Restless Ridgeline that comes in here, which is good against control. If you're not coming up against a lot of control, you could sub this out. Then the Painland of the Carplusian Forest and the Fastland of the Copperline Gorge dramatically help this deck out. And yeah, I think that pretty much covers it. All right, fourth up on the list is Mono Black Discard, and if you're an old Magic player like me, you might know it as the Rack. And you're basically attacking your opponent's resources. So we have Cut Down and Go for the Throat to attack our opponent's creatures. Early interaction makes it good against Mono Red and Rakdos aggro. We've got the Hopeless Nightmare and the Ruthless Negotiation, which attacks our opponent's hand, as well as the Thoughtstalker Warlock and the Deep Cavern Bat, so we can really mess with our opponent's strategy. We have the Shieldred's Edict and the Anoint with Affliction for further creature removal. And then this is our main win condition, which is Bandit's Talent, being able to sap the opponent for 2 life if they have 1 or fewer cards in hand, and then giving us also additional draw. The upgraded version of this is bringing in Liliana of the Veil to further attack on the hand, but also give yourself an alternative win condition. Destroying, ultimate with Liliana of the Veil is definitely a way to win the game. Shielder the Apocalypse gives us an additional threat that can kind of close out the game if they do have an answer for our bandit's talent. We have the Rankle's Prank, which allows us to further hate on the opponent's hand as well as their creatures and their life total. So I like a 1-of in this deck. Also, the Tiny Bones the Pickpocket does pretty well of being able to... you kill something early of theirs, you're then able to kill them with their own creatures. Oh, I forgot to mention that this one has some poor matchups. So like how we've seen Selesnya Rabbits dip out of the top 8, what we saw with Mono Black Discard last season was as Mono Red decreases in popularity, then Discard has some unfavorable matchups. So the time to play the Mono Black Discard is now. And the 5th and final list that I would like to talk about is Mono Blue Tempo. And so there's actually a way to take Mono Blue Tempo that I talked about last season that is exploring some more of the mythics and some more of the rares. But with the addition of the Abhorrent Oculus, we're going to see more of an Azorius build come to be. So I'll talk about that in the upgrade and kind of why I think that if you're starting out to Magic, who is the ideal audience for this video, why I think you should try to go in this direction as opposed to the more specific mono blue build. And so, for example, founding the third path is not usually included in the mono blue tempo builds because you're not reanimating specifically in this strategy, but I included it here in the budget build because you will be using it in Azorius Mentor, which I expect to be a top performing list. At least from the early data, it's looking like it's going to be at least in the top 5 and is probably here to stay. So if you're going to build towards that list, then the advantage of this is it gives you that self-mill, and the self-mill can then be used to make your Tolarian Terror and your Eddie Mert Crab very cheap to play, which is kind of the theme of this deck. Haughty Djinn has been included this as the one rare in a lot of budget builds. In this one, I'm ditching it because we're seeing Djinn not being played as much in the upgraded list. And we've got Curate, which further gives us some more fuel for putting stuff into our graveyard. Same with Chart a Course. Actually discarding a sorcery from your hand is pretty decent. We have Afara's Dispersal and Into the Floodmaw to mess up mono red, and makes this deck actually pretty good against mono red. And the general tempo of it can be difficult for control as well because of being able to cheaply bring out a threat that they then need to wrath the board, and then you play another threat. It's not a go wide strategy. So kind of an interesting one if you're looking at something that wants to beat control as well as mono red aggro. Recommend mono blue. And I did a full video on that. If you'd like to go strictly mono blue, look for my build in Bloomborough. Sleight of Hand also allows us to get kind of the spell count up while sifting through and allowing us to run a lower land count. Oh, and Don't Make a Sound is a quench that allows us to do a Surveil if they do pay the 2 lands. So as of today, the Azorius Oculus list was second to the Boros Auras deck that I showcased yesterday. And so that's why I'm saying I think this one's going to be here to stay unless something like dethrones it. So as far as the crafts go, it's not terribly expensive. The largest investment is going to be in on the lands, which again is not a bad thing because you'll have those lands for any Azorius decks in the future. So we see the fast land, we've got the Meticulous Archive, which you see less commonly, but still pretty common in Azorius because of the Surveil being important for control and for graveyard matters like this deck. The Flood Farm Verge we got, and we'll see if this one's actually going to be included in future builds. I think it looks pretty promising. We didn't get a Verge land for every color pair. It's just the ones that have a neighbor in the form of the mana clock. So like white, blue, black, red, green. And so if you've got the Verge lands, I think they're going to play well. After time will tell, but it looks good. And then we have the Painland of A Darker Wastes. As far as the threats go, we've got the Monastery Mentor, and this allows us to create a 1/1 every time that you're casting a non-creature spell, which this deck does very well. And then we have the Abhorrent Oculus, and this was the card that I think is going to replace the Haughty Djinn. I was in my brews last week, I was thinking that maybe it was possible that we'd see both, and they kind of have some weird tension against each other, because if you have to hard cast the Oculus, you're going to be exiling your graveyard. So it's probably going to be either or, and I think that we're going to see leaning towards the Mythic, which is a little unfortunate for those who don't have the Mythic wildcards. I do think Haughty Djinn is definitely a alternative if you don't have the Mythics. So the reason why we were doing all of this graveyard synergies is not just to get the Tolarian Terror out and the Eddingworth Crab, but instead be able to run 6 reanimation spells of Helping Hand and Recommission, which allows us to return something with mana value 3 or less from the graveyard to the battlefield. And so it's a cheap way to get the Monastery Mentor and the Oculus onto the battlefield, and then gives us the also makes it so that we don't have to exile our graveyard to be able to actually cast the Oculus. The rest of it is just enabling that strategy, getting the graveyard up and going. And like I said, I'll be talking about this one in my best of 1, best of 3 meta review on Monday. Looks like a sweet deck. Really excited to play it once I finally bite the bullet on crafting the Oculus. So leave a comment below if you play any of these decks. Let me know how they did for you. I know sometimes kind of miss the mark with how the meta is going to shift. Like last time I was talking about the Simic Cookies deck that we all thought looked well positioned for after rotation, and then kind of struggled to perform. It wasn't bad, it was just not tier 1, right? It was still above a 50% win rate though. And enough of my ramblings. Hope this helps you out if you're new to Magic the Gathering. Feel free to ask me any questions. Be like, hey, I don't have this card, would this work instead? Love talking about Magic cards. That's why I do this. And I will catch you all on Monday for my meta review. Take care, everybody.